Very good.
All right.
Hump.
Oh, by the way, I love you showed me yesterday during the sound check. You did a little.
Hey, you got to loosen up, you know.
Yeah.
All
It
right.
was pretty loose.
We're rolling.
Okay. So thank you, Larry, for agreeing to do this interview. I am truly honored, and I've been wanting to do this for the longest time.
It's all right. Just have my check ready. Whenever
What was
possible.
that about? As long as it's got the color green. You
Oh
told
yeah,
me
I don't
it's
care
red.
what color the people are that come here, as long as they bring the green.
So I'm going to just go back a little bit and,
Be my
just,
guest.
Um,
I tell the truth no matter what. Sometimes
The
they don't
truth,
like it.
nothing but the
Then
truth.
sometimes they don't like it, but
you know what?
what are you gonna do? I don't care.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good. So, you once said in an interview that it was the trips that you took to the music school that your mom made you go to that basically got you started with Latin music.
Well, I went to school in a very prestigious school in New York City called the Highschool of Music and Art, which was located in the barrio Latino in Manhattan, Upper Manhattan. And I was a Brooklyn kid, and both my parents were in music, and you had to take this very hard examination and audition to get into the school, and they took very few people. I think they only took 200 people a year into the school. So I was always the teacher's pet and would play in the auditoriums and stuff like that in public school. And I took this audition to go to the school, and I passed the audition, and I wound up in Music and Art High School. And I did 4 years there. And I used to take a bus from my house for half an hour to the train, to the subway, and then another hour changing 2 trains to get up to 137th Street in Manhattan and Convent Avenue, which was where Music and Art was. The great part about this school was that it was all musicians and art students. I don't mean dancers and stuff or actors, but artists, people studying architecture and painting and drawing and animation. And the other half were music students, mostly classical players. And they had 4 or 5 symphonies, and they had all different kinds of music programs. So you would take your regular academics and then another 4 hours of music every single day. So when I used to get out of the subway, I had to walk up this big hill up through the park and right through this neighborhood that had all these Hispanic bodegas and mom and pop record stores. And I would hear all this great music playing. I didn't know what it was at that particular moment. I was a jazzer. I wanted to be a jazz player. Unfortunately, in the 50s, if you were not African American or you were not an intravenous drug user, you were not accepted in jazz circles. So since I was neither, I kind of like moved to the next closest form of music where I could improvise, and that was Latin music. And I would listen to this music coming out of all these stores and say, wow, this is really swinging. So I would investigate a little further and start buying records and became a record collector. And in those days, it was the very beginnings of what we called mambo music, Latin American music, mostly Machito, early Tito Puente and the Piccadilly Boys, the beginnings of Tito Rodriguez, Machito, La Playa Sextet, and things like that. And I was asked to play in this Latin band that was mainly 90% African American guys that played up in Harlem, and a guy by the name of Hugo Dickens, who had 3 or 4 orchestras going at one time. He had so much work he couldn't keep one going, so he would make 2 or 3. And they needed a piano player, and they said, do you know how to read music? I said, of course I know how to read. I'm a music student. So, and they would play these old Cuban stocks that were printed on recycled paper, Mambo number 1, Mambo number 5, da, 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 you know, really simple stuff. And I would look at the music, and I would play don, chin, don. I would read what was on the paper. And they say, wow, you play terrible. You know, I don't know if we can keep you in the band. I really felt really bad. So I ran down to these record stores and I bought a Noro Morales record, who was a great Puerto Rican pianist, and a Joe Loco record, who was another pianist, and Rene Touzé, guys like that. And I would memorize their solos. Latin music at that particular time was really very simple. It was based on 2 chord progressions, 1 chord progression, maybe 4 chord progressions. and they say take a solo. So I knew how to play a C7 solo, I knew how to play a 1-4-5 progression, and I would memorize their solos. And I'd go to the next rehearsal, and I'd say, okay, piano solo, and I'd roll off a Norma Morales solo. It wasn't me making it up, I was doing it by memory. And they said, okay, we're going to keep you in the band. So I felt good. And little by little, the one or two Hispanic musicians that were in the band kind of explained clave to me, how clave fit in the scheme of Latin music. And being the musician that I was, I could see it on the paper. I could see it physically on the paper. And then I saw how the orchestrations fell and how everything fell on these beats, on these clave beats. And I started to understand a little more how the basic rhythms of Afro-Cuban music. Then I started collecting, and I started getting into the real deal. I started listening to Chapotin and Arsenio, and Orchestra Aragon, and Orchestra Riverside, and all the Benny Moré, and all the great musicians that were in Cuba. And started playing with these little bands in the Catskills, in the Catskill Mountains, which were, a little north of New York City, about an hour and a half north. And they had what they call rumba bands, Well, there was a band that plays for the show, and then there was a little relief band that played mambo and cha-cha. And they were mostly Jewish people or Italian people, and they would take mambo lessons, and they would take cha-cha lessons, and they would take tango lessons. And I must say that the Jews kind of supported Latin music because they were affluent enough to go to Cuba and listen and bring these dances back to the United States. Then all of a sudden the dance schools started popping up, Arthur Murray, and and all these little dance schools that taught ballroom dancing, and it was just absolutely wonderful. So little by little, I would play every summer on my high school summer vacation with a little 4 or 5 or 6-piece band in the Catskills. Now up in the Catskills, there were maybe 100 hotels, and of the 100 hotels, maybe 25 had Latin bands. So Charlie Palmieri was in one hotel, Eddie Palmieri in another, Tito Puente in another, Joe Cuban in another, Machito at the Concord, this one over here. And the place that I played was a place called Shanks Paramount, which was like in the middle of everything, and it was a place that had the late night club. So everything would wrap up 12 or 1 in the morning, and then all the musicians, all the Latin musicians used to come to my spot, and we would have these impromptu descargas or impromptu jam sessions, and we would start experimenting. And by 1961, when Cuba was shut off with the embargo, and we couldn't get new records coming from Cuba, we couldn't hear it on the radio, we couldn't get the Cuban bands in the States anymore, especially in New York, we started experimenting. In the beginnings of Latin music, the lyrical content was very simple. It was para bailar, para gozar, 1, 2, 3, together, 1, 2, 3, cha-cha-cha, bailando. So it really didn't have any meaning to the songs. They were kind of like party songs. And of course, the harmonic structure of the songs were very simple also, based on these 1, 4, 5 chords, maybe a 7th chord, a dominant 7th chord. So what these musicians would do is they would write new material, and we'd experiment with all of this in these late night jam sessions all these summers. We would add New York jazz harmonies and expand the chordal structures from 6th and 7th chords to 9ths, 11ths, augmented 13th chords. Then the arrangements started to get fatter and bigger. And the composers at that time, don't forget, the 1960s were the time of revolt in the United States. It was revolution everywhere. The civil rights movement, Woodstock, Vietnam, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it was just amazing what was going on. Everything was changing. So the composers started writing songs that had real content to it. They would write about humanity. They would write about love. They would write about politics. They would write about anything they felt like. So there was now a song structure. So there was the introduction, the guia of the song, the head of the song, a bridge, out of the bridge into the montuno section, into the moña, the mambo section, and it really started to develop into a little bigger sound. And I started contemplating all these new rhythms, and in my first year in college, I decided to take a vacation, and I went to Havana on a Christmas vacation with what we call the Mambo Nicks. The Mambo Nicks were these American kids, 18, 19 years old, that loved to dance mambo and cha-cha, mostly Jewish and Italian guys. And we all hung out together. We used to go to the Palladium together, and we went to Cuba for the first time and got off the plane, and here we were in a paradise, a mambo paradise. And there was a band on every corner. There was a band in every restaurant. There was national radio, national TV going on for free every single day. All the clubs were $1, $2. It was just amazing. So I stayed for 8 days, and unfortunately had to come back, and I came home, and then 2 months later I decided to take a little sabbatical from from my college education, and I packed up and I went to Havana. But I was a little smarter. I brought cameras, a big old Webcore 60-pound tape recorder, reel-to-reel, you know, a lot of film, a lot of pencils, music paper, and stuff like that. And I started making friends with all the musicians and with the people at the university, and wound up going to school and studying. And my Spanish kept getting a little better, poco a poco. Everything was nice, but I was kind of permitted to go on the band buses, especially with Aragon, especially with Roberto Faz, to all the different provinces in Cuba when they played their gigs, when they played their dances, and just from hanging out, I learned so much. I mean, you couldn't find this in books what I learned, and I taped everything I could. I taped all the folklore stuff, and wound up getting a little curious about the rumbas, about the bembes, about the toques, about Santeria, about all this little African stuff that was going on beneath the music scene. But really, that's the basis of everything, because it all came from the motherland, it all came from Africa.